Our lecture for this morning. So we will be discussing. Can you hear me? Is my audio okay?
Yes po, Doc.
Okay, thank you. Sige, okay. So my reference for this 22nd edition. The goal is to introduce to you the common renal diseases in children, how to approach children with hematuria, proteinuria, tubular disorders, and acute renal diseases. Is filtration. So it filters our blood, no, with electrolytes, the glucose, urea, creatinine, and albumin, and other production and secretion of the urine. Okay, so the best function is through your glomerular. It's affected by your. Okay, it is also affected by your Can you see the slides now? Nawala kasi siya. Okay. Good morning again. Was this the last slide that I was discussing earlier before I got disconnected? Or the
Dok, yung
previous?
last slide. Yung previous slide.
Sorry. Here, is it this one?
Yes po, Dok.
This one, the GFR.
Yes po.
Okay. So, okay, I'll just start. I'll turn off my video so we'll have a better, or at least reduce the lagging. Okay. So going back to the glomerular filtration rate, no, as I've mentioned, if you heard it earlier, no, that the kidneys is your filtration organ. It filters your blood, no, with the electrolytes, glucose, and other substances, no, like your creatinine and proteins. And then it goes through the tubules where it undergoes reabsorption and secretion, then eventually excreted as the urine. Okay, so the best way to measure kidney function is through your glomerular filtration rate, which is affected by your hydrostatic and oncotic pressure, glomerular blood flow, and capillary permeability. Okay, now how can we measure GFR? No, so we need to measure a substance that is freely filtered, not reabsorbed, and not secreted by the tubules. And the ideal substrate for this is your inulin. However, inulin determination requires a tedious monitoring. So parang serial monitoring kasi yan of your inulin. That's why it's expensive as well and tedious. That's the same with your radioisotope 99, your TCDTPA. No, it's also expensive and requires monitoring of your serum and urine samples. So an easier way to estimate GFR. Okay, so is my audio okay? Is mahina ba? Wait
Clear
lang.
naman po.
Very clear. Okay, sige. Thank you. So an easier way to estimate this is by using your serum creatinine. No? It's freely filtered, no, but creatinine is affected by muscle mass, the age and sex of the patient. No? However, creatinine is the more available substrate as compared to cystatin C. No? The cystatin C is a better measure of GFR because it is less affected by those factors I mentioned earlier, no? And it's also not secreted by the renal tubules. So when you use your serum creatinine, you estimate the GFR, and we use the bedside Schwartz formula. It's 0.413 times height in centimeters divided by serum creatinine. Okay. Now, let's go to the first problem. No, it's most common problem in pediatric renal diseases is your hematuria. So let's define it first. Hematuria is the persistent presence of more than 5 RBCs per high power field in uncentrifuged urine. Okay, but significant hematuria would have more than 50 RBCs. So ibig sabihin, you most probably have a nephrologic problem, no? For 10 to 50, yung in between natin na RBCs, it may suggest an underlying pathology. It may not be renal all the time, no? So you have to do the subsequent diagnostics. So if you see hematuria or RBCs in your urine, you have to confirm it with microscopic analysis. What if you see red urine, pero in the urinalysis, there's no RBCs? No? It may be due to hemoglobinuria or myoglobinuria. And hemoglobinuria is due to acute or chronic hemolysis. while your myoglobinuria, it occurs in rhabdomyolysis, in the lysis of your skeletal muscles. Other causes of red urine without RBCs would be your different dyes in food, various drugs, and urinary metabolites. Okay, so these are the different diseases that may present with hematuria. So in patients with hematuria, you have to complete your history and physical examination because more or less you can narrow down your diagnosis in just a complete history and physical examination. So the basic laboratory that you have to request for if you are presented with a patient with hematuria is, of course, your urinalysis. Now, hematuria may originate from the upper urinary tract or from the lower urinary tract, and you can differentiate between the two with the color. No? If it's a bright red urine, then the hematuria is probably coming from the lower urinary tract. While if it's a darker colored or cola-colored urine, it's from the upper urinary tract. Okay. So from the upper urinary tract, you have isolated renal diseases. And the most common of which is your post-infectious or your post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Other diseases with hematuria presenting with multisystemic manifestations would be your SLE nephritis, your IgA vasculitis, which is previously known as your Henoch-Schönlein line purpura. Tubulointerstitial diseases are mostly secondary to infection or pyelonephritis. Vascular diseases may also present with hematuria. Same thing with your anatomic diseases. Okay. For the lower urinary tract, most often it's because of an inflammation or infection. So urethritis, cystitis, even urolithiasis, especially during the passage of the stones. Bladder problems such as tumor or maybe ureterocele, they may also cause hematuria, bright red urine. Okay. So what are you going to do? So you're presented at the emergency room with the chief complaint of hematuria. So you have to ask the color of the urine. Again, it would tell us if it's coming from upper urinary tract or the lower urinary tract. Same with proteinuria if it's associated with RBC casts and the presence of your acute nephritic syndrome. If it's yes, then you're probably dealing with glomerular hematuria. So you have to do the following laboratory test. And this would differentiate or would tell us, confirm the diagnosis of hematuria. What if there's no cola-colored urine, there's no proteinuria, then you're dealing with extraglomerular hematuria. Again, for lower urinary tract, the most common would be infection. So you do your urine culture and so on. Okay. Okay, the most common cause of hematuria in children would be your acute post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Okay, so PSGN, this is the classic example of your acute nephritic syndrome. Your acute nephritic syndrome is composed of sudden onset of gross hematuria, edema, hypertension, and renal dysfunction. And this is commonly seen in children 5 to 12 years old. So if it occurs before age of 5 or 3, then it is already an atypical presentation. Even if it presents above the age of 12, no, it is already an atypical presentation. Okay, and your acute post-streptococcal GN or PSGN is caused by your group A beta hemolytic streptococcal. Okay, so what happens? The onset of symptoms is usually preceded by your streptococcal infection. So for acute pharyngitis, usually it is 1 to 2 weeks. For skin infection, symptoms would present after 3 to 6 weeks. Okay. So these nephrogenic strains of your group A beta hemolytic strep, it mimics it is related to the M protein, and then it mimics That's why it's called molecular mimicry. No? It mimics the components of your glomerular basement membrane. So what happens is that your circulating antibodies react with the normal glomerular antigens and form immune complexes. Now, these immune complex formation are deposited in the glomerular basement membrane. No? So if you remember in your pathology class, this is the lumpy bumpy characteristic of PSGN in the microscope. Okay. So molecular mimicry, the in situ complex formation, and the complement activation that is triggered no, by the deposition of your immune complexes are actually the immunologic mechanism for your PSGN. Okay. So with glomerular injury, there would be a decrease in GFR, excuse me, resulting in, I'm sorry, so the direct cause of glomerular injury will cause hematuria, and then the decrease in GFR will result into oliguria and renal insufficiency. So with the decrease in GFR, there would be salt and water retention. That's why you have edema and hypertension. And this completes your nephritic syndrome. Okay. Now, patients with PSGN demonstrates red blood cell casts in the urine. No? Proteinuria may also be seen, but it's usually transient. No? And polymorphonuclear leukocytes are seen because of the inflammation as well. But it doesn't mean that the patient also has a urinary tract infection. Your CBC may also show mild normochromic anemia because of hemodilution. Now, one of the most significant or laboratory that would be confirmatory for PSGNs would be your serum C3. Now, serum C3 would be significantly reduced in more than 90% of patients during the acute phase, and it usually returns to normal after 8 to 10 weeks. So you note that this is the 8 to 10 weeks is in red, no, because in the previous edition, it's 6 to 8 weeks. So part of the monitoring after admission, after the acute phase, is the repeat of your serum C3. We have to see that it becomes normal again after 8 to 10 weeks. And that would be a definitive diagnosis for your PSGN. Okay. Now, other diagnostics, no, KUB ultrasound is not really, it's not mandatory. It's not recommended that we do KUB ultrasound for these patients. Similarly, no, MRI is not indicated, and it's only for those patients with severe neurologic symptoms. Why? Because of your hypertensive encephalopathy. Because of hypertension, no, they present sometimes with seizure or blurring of vision. And in MRI, when you do MRI, you'll see posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. And this is completely reversible, okay? As the name implies. Now, chest x-ray can also be done for those patients presenting with heart failure or respiratory distress. And this is probably because, this is most likely because of the fluid retention. No? That's why they go into heart failure or respiratory distress. Okay, for the in PSGN, confirmation requires the evidence of prior streptococcal infection, no? Because as the name implies, it should be post-streptococcal infection. So we should have an evidence. No? And how can we do it? We can get it from a throat culture, an elevated ASO titer, no, from a previous pharyngeal infection. Actually, it's generalized, no, for streptococcal infection, but it's more specific for strep infection. For anti-DNase B, this is also positive for those with previous skin infection. Okay, now a streptozyme test which is, however, not available no, in our setting, is a better serologic confirmation, but because it measures multiple antibodies. But again, unfortunately, it's not available. So for the diagnosis of your PSGN, you have to your patient has to present clinically with your acute nephritic syndrome, an evidence of recent streptococcal infection, and a low C3 level. Okay. So what else should we consider? No, this is a table. This is also in your book, in your Nelson's. When you are presented with the clinical features of acute glomerulonephritis, then you have to, again, the most important laboratory would be your ASO and your C3 level. Now, if you have a low C3, you have to consider, other than your PSGN, you have to consider lupus nephritis, subacute bacterial endocarditis, your shunt nephritis, and the others. No? But if you have a normal serum complement, then you have to think of another disease. It's probably not PSGN. Okay, so you think of other vasculitic syndromes. Okay, so if you have a low C3 level, let's go back to the low C3, then you have an evidence of streptococcal infection, which is your ASO. Then it's most probably an acute nephritic acute post-streptococcal GN. No? And then you have to monitor your C3. Again, normal C3 should be achieved by 8 to 10 weeks. Now, this is the new from this 22nd edition. If it doesn't normalizes, then you have your persistent hypocomplementemia, and you have to think of other diseases such as your lupus nephritis, bacterial endocarditis, shunt nephritis, your cryoglobulinemia, visceral abscess, or your membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis. So you need more diagnostics. Now you have to work up your patient because your nephritic syndrome may be just the initial manifestation. Okay. So, ayan pala. Next. So, complications. Acute complications of your PSGN result from hypertension and acute renal dysfunction. Like your acute kidney injury or your acute renal failure, it presents with oliguria or sometimes anuria if you have severe renal insufficiency. No? So, they will also present with signs of uremia, hyperkalemia, and acidosis. What else? Hypertensive encephalopathy. So I've mentioned this a little earlier. No? So hypertension is actually a common manifestation for PSGN. More than 60% of patients. No? And 10% of those would have hypertensive encephalopathy. So you'll see there are signs of neurologic deficiency rather. So MRI for these patients is indicated. Now, what else? Another complication would be your heart failure and pulmonary edema. So these are the patients who present with respiratory distress, orthopnea, maybe heart gallop, no? So chest X-ray is indicated. Now, PSGN actually is a self-limiting disease, no? But of course, we are afraid of the complications. So that's why the goal for treatment is to treat the effects of acute renal insufficiency and hypertension. So first, we have to address the nephritogennic organisms. So penicillin G is actually given to limit the spread of nephritogennic organisms, and this is given for 10 weeks. But it does not shorten the course of the disease. Again, it is self-limiting. We are just treating the acute effects of your renal insufficiency and hypertension. So since that is our main goal, we should do sodium restriction and diuresis. And the most effective among the diuretics would be your loop diuretic, your furosemide. Now, antihypertensive drugs, if diuretics is not adequate, no, despite giving your loop diuretics, no, you still have hypertension. So here comes your calcium channel blockers. You can use those, and vasodilators or ACE inhibitors. Okay, how about the prognosis? It has a good prognosis. No? Complete recovery in 95% of children. Recurrences are extremely rare. No, I think in my years of practice, I only saw one. No? So that's again an indication for renal biopsy. Chronic renal disease progression. No? It occurs in just less than 2% of affected children. And these are the patients who present with oliguria and or anuria. No? Yeah. Okay. So I've mentioned earlier about renal biopsy. So when is it indicated? If your patient has persistent microscopic hematuria. In your PSGN, remember this is the most common disease presenting with hematuria. So if you have persistent microscopic hematuria, and that is defined as more than 1 year of microscopic hematuria, because in your PSGN, hematuria usually resolves within a year. So if hematuria persists, then an renal biopsy is indicated. When you have recurrent cross hematuria, cross hematuria for PSGN, it may persist for 4 weeks. No, but if you have recurrent, nagkaroon ulit, gross hematuria, not microscopic, this is cross hematuria, then a renal biopsy is indicated because it is not the typical course of your PSGN. Okay? Now, for acute renal insufficiency, this is one of your nephritic syndrome, one of the components. No, but if your patient presents with acute renal insufficiency, once your patient is stabilized, a renal biopsy is also indicated. Why? Because they may have formation of crescents or other signs of other diseases that is not PSGN. Okay, nephrotic syndrome. Nephrotic syndrome compared to nephritic syndrome is the presence of proteinuria. No? So I'll be discussing that later on. No? So if you have persistent proteinuria, then that is also an indication for renal biopsy. When you do not have an evidence of strep infection, and if you have persistent hypocomplementemia, decreased complement levels for more than 2 months after onset. So these are the indications of renal biopsy in PSGN patients. So among the isolated glomerular diseases, your PSGN is the most common. Okay. Now for multisystemic diseases, we have SLE nephritis, that is common in children. Now, just a review, SLE is a chronic autoimmune disease wherein there is are caused by your abnormal production of pathogenic autoantibodies to self-antigens. And it most commonly appears in adolescent females. Lupus nephritis is the most common presenting symptom for SLE in adolescents. And it is also the most important cause of morbidity and mortality. So, siguro 80% of patients would present with lupus nephritis. Okay? And this is a result of the deposition of circulating immune complexes and the direct binding of autoantibodies to glomerular components. And with that, similar with your PSGN, when your autoantibodies combine with your glomerular components, it activates your complement system. So it's also similar to your PSGN. So these patients also present with, again, it's a multisystemic disease. So you have multisystemic involvement. You have fever, weight loss, dermatitis, hematologic abnormalities, arthritis, and other involvement of other organs. And if you look at your EULAR and ACR criteria, they have specific recommendations for the diagnosis. Okay, how about laboratories? We have to confirm SLE, nephritis. So the presence of your ANA, anti-dsDNA antibodies should be present. Your C3 and C4 levels should also be decreased. But the gold standard for the diagnosis of your lupus nephritis is the kidney biopsy. And it tells us the staging of or the type of lupus nephritis the patient has. So the higher the stage, the greater is the affectation of your kidneys. So it's also associated with poorer prognosis. So what should we do? No, we have to treat these patients, and the goal of treatment should be your clinical remission and your serologic remission. Clinical remission means normalization of renal function and proteinuria. So magiging negative na tayo, +1 or less. Serologic remission means that you have normalization of your anti-DNA antibody and your C3 and C4 levels becomes normal. Okay, so how do we do this? Immunosuppression is the cornerstone of therapy in your SLE nephritis. Okay, and prednisone is the first line. Other therapies for SLE would be your hydroxychloroquine, and this addresses the extrarenal manifestations. And also, some studies, recent studies have shown that it also has an effect with the controlling or with the normalization of proteinuria. Your ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers will be used to control your hypertension and also for the proteinuria. These agents, these antihypertensive agents, your ACE inhibitors and your angiotensin receptor blockers, they have shown to be effective for reducing your proteinuria. So we use it sometimes, most of the time actually, we use it in combination with your prednisone. Okay, so another multisystemic disease that may present with hematuria would be your IgA vasculitis, excuse me, nephritis. So this is formerly known as your Henoxion line purpura. So your Henoxion line purpura, it is again an immune complex mediated vasculitis. And this is associated with your IgA deposition within small vessel walls. Okay, so this is the most common actually of small vessel vasculitis in children. And the peak incidence of these is at 4 to 6 years of age. Okay, so approximately 50% of your HSP or your IgA vasculitis patients would develop renal manifestations, and they vary. Some would have asymptomatic, microscopic hematuria lang sila, and others may have severe progressive glomerulonephritis. Okay. So the tetrad for the diagnosis of your IgA vasculitis are palpable purpura, arthritis or arthralgia, abdominal pain, and evidence of renal disease. So I've mentioned earlier that it can range from microscopic hematuria to a significant glomerulonephritis and even proteinuria. Okay, excuse me. Now, skin biopsy is it's a diagnostic for IgA vasculitis, and it shows leukocytoplastic vasculitis with IgA, C3, and fibrin deposition. Same with renal biopsy. If patient would present with renal manifestations, renal disease, then we recommend a renal biopsy, and it will show IgA deposits in the glomerular mesangium, and that is the new pathognomonic findings in renal biopsy for IgA vasculitis. So what do we do? Sometimes urinary abnormalities may not appear initially. They may appear up to 6 months after the disease onset. So we have to still monitor urinalysis weekly during the active clinical disease. And when is that? The active clinical disease is when you have all the purpura, when you have the arthralgias and abdominal pain. Those are signs that you're still in the active phase. So for active disease, you have to monitor urinalysis weekly. Okay, but after that, we monitor urinalysis at least once a month up to 6 months. So if there would be no urinalysis abnormalities, then most probably nephritis is unlikely to develop. Okay. Now, treatment and prognosis. Spontaneous and complete resolution is very common, no? And it occurs in majority. So severe renal involvement usually is indicative of a poor prognosis. So patients with nephrotic range proteinuria or elevated creatinine, hypertension, yung mga other manifestations seen in your nephritic syndrome, they would require renal biopsy. And patients with proteinuria would require immunosuppression as well, similar with your SLE nephritis. Okay. Now, 2 to 5% may progress to CKD if left untreated. So that's why we have to monitor. No? As I've mentioned earlier, we have to monitor up to 6 months just to check if renal involvement would appear later on. No? So for those with CKD, then we have to do renal transplantation. Okay, now let's go to proteinuria. Proteinuria, you have 3 types of proteinuria. It can either be glomerular, tubular, or because of increased production of plasma proteins. So abnormal amounts of protein may appear because if it's glomerular, it occurs because of the disruption of your glomerular capillary wall. For tubular proteinuria, it is most probably caused by your tubular injury or dysfunction and leads to ineffective reabsorption of your low molecular weight proteins. And it may also be due to increased production of your plasma protein, no, as seen in multiple myeloma, rhabdomyolysis, or hemolysis. No? And this may cause production or release of very large amounts of protein that are filtered at the glomerulars and overwhelm the absorptive capacity of your proximal tubule. That's why we spill it out. Okay, now there are 3 types of proteinuria. It could be transient, orthostatic, or fixed proteinuria. Your transient proteinuria is defined as an initial reading of protein, but it does not exceed 1 plus to 2 plus on dipstick. But if you repeat your urinalysis using dipstick, it becomes negative. So what causes this transient proteinuria? It could be due to fever, exercise, dehydration, etc. Okay? So another type of proteinuria is your orthostatic proteinuria. And orthostatic proteinuria, it occurs in 60% of children. So orthostatic is usually seen in the latter part of the day. No? So you have to repeat your urinalysis and get the first void urine output. And then you can already at least rule out if it's orthostatic proteinuria. So what happens? Ano ba mechanism nitong orthostatic proteinuria? Actually, it's still not confirmed, no? But they have postulated that maybe in supine position, they excrete normal amounts of protein, but in upright position, it increases. Why? Because there is an altered hemodynamics, no? Because there is partial obstruction of your left renal vein. So yun yung proposed cause, but it's not really proven yet. No? So evaluation, as I've said, is that you have to repeat your urinalysis, but you have to get the first morning void. Now, for fixed proteinuria, it is defined as first morning urine sample that is more than 1 plus on dipstick test. Okay, so the most common among these is your idiopathic nephrotic syndrome. So for fixed proteinuria, it is because of a kidney disease. So you have to just find out if it's idiopathic nephrotic syndrome. Is it associated with your multisystemic diseases or tubular diseases? Okay, so your idiopathic nephrotic syndrome is actually a constellation of clinical manifestations associated with Number one is your heavy proteinuria or your nephrotic range proteinuria. And your nephrotic range proteinuria is defined as more than 3.5 grams per 24 hours of protein. And for urine protein creatinine ratio or your UPCR, it's more than 2. No? So in association with that, you should have also this triad: hypoalbuminemia, edema, and hyperlipidemia. All of these are a result of your urinary losses of protein. And this affects children less than 16 years of age. Okay. Now, the causes of nephrotic syndrome, it's either idiopathic, hereditary, or secondary nephrotic syndrome. So idiopathic nephrotic syndrome, these are diseases that are glomerular in origin, and the most common of which for children would be your minimal change disease. For hereditary nephrotic syndrome, congenital nephrotic syndrome usually occurs during the first year of life, and these are due to hereditary disease and due to your collagen mutations. So you have to do chromosomal analysis for this patient. For secondary nephrotic syndrome, so these are usually secondary to infections or drugs, or again, associated with multisystemic diseases. Okay, now for the pathogenesis of nephrotic syndrome, the glomerular filtration barrier, is compromised. So there is actually food process effacement. Excuse me. It may be immune mediated as well due to systemic circulating factors, or it could also be non-immune due to podocyte-related factors, or genetic variants, as I've mentioned earlier. But the resulting pathology would be your food process effacement. So there is decrease in the number of your functional podocytes and altered slit diaphragm integrity. So it increases your capillary permeability, increases your protein leakiness across your glomerular capillary wall, resulting in your massive proteinuria and hypoalbuminemia. So what are the clinical consequences or clinical manifestations of patients with nephrotic range proteinuria? Of course, the most common presenting sign would be your edema. And there are two theories explaining edema in patients with nephrotic syndrome. Actually, they are opposing. The other one is underfill, and the other is overfill theory. So for the underfill theory or hypothesis, it is based on hypoalbuminemia because you have decreased oncotic pressure. There is also leakage of plasma water into the interstitium. So parang nag-third spacing siya, leading to your edema formation. So why is it underfill theory? Because even if the patient is edematous, the intravascular volume is actually depleted. So there is other factors. There are other factors that come into play, like your vasopressin, your antinatriuretic factor, and your aldosterone. So leading into further sodium and water retention. So yun yung underfill theory. So on the other hand, overfill theory is associated with sodium retention. This is with subsequent volume expansion and leakage of the excess fluid in the interstitium. So actually, ang sinasabi naman ni overfill theory is that there is intravascular overfill. Sobra naman ng water. But, we have to just be cautious of addressing the edema of patients with nephrotic syndrome because they may be intravascularly depleted kahit na edematous sila. So very important to monitor your vital signs, your blood pressure, and your heart rate. Okay? Now, hyperlipidemia. Now, hyperlipidemia in nephrotic syndrome is caused by increased synthesis and decreased catabolism of lipids. So what happens is that the liver is trying to compensate for the decreased serum protein. At the same time, no, while the liver is doing that, it also increases the synthesis of lipids. So tumataas ang ating lipids in the blood, no? And also there is already altered lipase activity because also of your losses in the urine. Okay? Now, increased susceptibility to infections for nephrotic syndrome is this occurs because of the urinary losses then of your IgG and your defects in the complement cascade from loss of complement factors in your urine as well. So hindi lang protein ang nilileak out natin, also your immunoglobulins and your complement factors. So they are prone to have cellulitis, spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, and bacteremia. Now, children with nephrotic syndrome also has increased hypercoagulability state. No? Why? Because actually it's multifactorial. They have vascular stasis from hemoconcentration because of the intravascular volume depletion. No? There is also increased platelet number and aggregability and changes in coagulation factor levels. No? There is also, because of the liver trying to compensate for the hypoalbuminemia, it also increases the production of fibrinogen. So lahat sila tumataas. So these contribute to the hypercoagulable state of nephrotic syndrome patients. So deep venous thrombosis may occur in these patients. Okay. So what happens during in minimal change disease is that it's usually is followed by minor infections. No? Uncommonly, it may be due to the reaction to insect bites or bee stings or a poison ivy. And this causes food process effacement, which increases the glomerular capillary permeability that causes the protein to leak out of the urine, causing the classic signs of your nephritic syndrome, which is your massive proteinuria, hypoalbuminemia, edema, and hyperlipidemia. Now, the edema usually is presents around the eyes, no, periorbital, and in the lower extremities. So a diagnosis other than your minimal change nephrotic syndrome should be considered in children less than 1 year old with positive family history of nephrotic syndrome. It could be not minimal change. It could be focal segmental glomerulonephritis, no? Or the presence of extrarenal findings. It could be a secondary nephrotic syndrome. And nephritic features such as your hypertension and or pulmonary edema. Chronic renal insufficiency or acute renal insufficiency with gross hematuria, these patients would require further workup and a renal biopsy should be contemplated already. Okay, now the investigation in child with nephrotic syndrome, this is recently added in the 22nd edition. The diagnosis is confirmed by urinalysis, which reveals a +3 to +4 proteinuria. And microscopic hematuria also, I just have to mention, it may be present in 20% of children, okay, with nephrotic syndrome. A spot urine protein to creatinine ratio of more than 2. Serum albumin is low at less than 2.5 grams per deciliter, and the serum cholesterol and triglyceride levels are elevated. No? This comprises your nephrotic syndrome, no, the triad. The serum BUN and creatinine is usually normal, no, but it may be elevated, no, if there is diminished intravascular volume. Unlike for nephritic syndrome, the first disease that was discussed, no, they have increased creatinine most of the time. No? So for serum complement levels, they are normal, no? This is again opposite of that with your nephritic syndrome. So in children 10 years and above and shows extrarenal signs, further investigation should be done. Okay, to rule out again your secondary causes of nephrotic syndrome. So this was the newly added diagnostics or approach to proteinuria in the 22nd edition. So basically, it just mentions that you have to do this step by step. No, but the basic investigation should be done to confirm the nephrotic syndrome, and the additional testing may only be done if you see other signs and symptoms other than your nephrotic syndrome. Okay. Now, the mainstay of therapy is corticosteroids. No, prednisone or your prednisolone is the recommended immunosuppression of choice. This is based on the KDIGO guidelines, kidney disease improving global outcomes. So we start with the 60 milligrams per BSA or 2 milligrams per kilogram per day with a maximum of 60 milligrams. So even if you compute for your BSA or your 2 MKD, then you just have to limit it to a maximum of 60 milligrams because higher than 60 milligrams will be associated with more side effects of your prednisone. No, so this is given for 4 to 6 weeks, followed by alternate day prednisone at 40 milligrams per BSA every other day, or 1.5 milligrams per kilogram every other day. So this is when tapering starts. No? So what would tell us that this patient is candidate for tapering, no? Or lowering down your prednisone? It's again the goal of therapy, no, to decrease, to normalize the proteinuria. So kapag normal protein na siya, pwede na tayong mag-taper ng immunosuppressant. Now for for edema, now we restrict the sodium to less than 1,500 milligrams a day. Also, we give water restriction, especially for patients with hyponatremia. Diuretics would also help with the excess fluids. At 25% albumin infusion may also be given, but there should be precaution. No? Not all patients with nephrotic syndrome should be given albumin. Okay, so it is given at 0.5 to 1 gram per kilogram in a slow drip. It may be to 2 to 4 hours. This is usually followed by a diuretic mid or post infusion of your albumin. Now, dyslipidemia is addressed by decreasing dietary fat in the in your daily diet, no? Also decreasing your dietary cholesterol to less than 300 milligrams per day. Now, for children, your HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors, no, we have insufficient data for its use, no? But recent studies have shown the use of HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors, ito yung mga statins natin, no? The use for children 10 years old and above, but no studies yet for children less than 10 years old. And they have shown to be effective naman, especially those patients with chronic kidney disease. Okay. So what else? How about infections? Now, I've mentioned the risk of developing cellulitis, your SBP and bacteremia. These are common, no, in patients with nephrotic syndrome. And once we have these patients, a third generation cephalosporin is recommended. Okay. Now, because of the hypercoagulability state of nephrotic syndrome, thromboembolism may be done. No? So we use anticoagulants like your heparin, low molecular heparin, and warfarin. Now, counseling is very important. No? Nephrotic syndrome sometimes becomes a chronic disease, especially when they are difficult to treat. No? So counseling, not just on obesity and growth, no? But because of the chronicity of the disease, is also important. Obesity and growth, this is associated with your chronic effects of your prednisone, of your steroids. No? So they should also be counseled about that because the compliance to medication is at risk. No? Kung minsan, because they have changes in their appearance, especially for adolescents, no, they discontinue the drug. And what happens is they will have a relapse. So they should be counseled, not just because of the effects of your steroids, but also for the chronicity of the disease. Okay, so treatment response. The prognosis is actually based on treatment response. So in remission, you have your UPCR of less than 2 or less than 1 plus proteinuria for 3 consecutive days. But a relapse is an increase in the first morning UPCR to more than 2 or 2 plus and higher proteinuria for 3 consecutive days. So if your patient has remission, early remission, then these patients will have a better prognosis. No? But if you have frequent relapses or the patient doesn't achieve remission, then it's associated with a poor prognosis. Now, definitions for steroid response, no, we usually label our patient based on their um, treatment response. No, for steroid responsive, these are the patients that attain remission within the first 4 weeks of treatment. No? So we just follow the recommended regimen, no? 4 to 6 weeks of high corticosteroid therapy and then the eventual tapering down of prednisone. Now, for frequent relapsers, these are patients with 2 or more relapses within 6 months after the first or after the initial therapy, or 4 relapses in 12-month period. These are patients that require renal biopsy, so that we'll have a more directed treatment or more directed immunosuppression. Same thing with your steroid-dependent nephrotic syndrome. So they are the patients with a relapse during steroid tapering or a relapse within 2 weeks of discontinuation of therapy. Actually, these patients can be maintained on low-dose prednisone. No? Kaya lang, syempre, the chronicity of the disease. No? We also have to think of the side effects. So these patients are also recommended to undergo renal biopsy for a better picture of the renal disease. And again, you may change your immunosuppression based on the renal biopsy findings. Steroid resistant, no, this is failure to achieve remission after 4 weeks. So do you have a choice that you can give your pulse, your methylprednisolone IV, and check if the patient responds. And if not, then you have to change your immunosuppression immediately. Okay. Now, again, so I've already mentioned for steroid responsive patients, they have relapses, decreases as the child grow older, and they are unlikely to develop CKD. But for steroid resistant, they are the ones who develop progressive renal insufficiency and eventually end-stage renal disease or your chronic kidney disease, stage 5. Now, how do we take care of our patients? For relapses of nephrotic syndrome, it is commonly triggered by infections. So it's very important that they complete their immunizations, their pneumococcal and influenza vaccines. Now, we can give live vaccines for prednisone, for these patients if the prednisone is already at low dose, below 1 milligram per kilogram per day, or 2 milligrams per kilogram on alternate days. Okay. So low dose, hindi na sila yung full dose na 2 milligrams every day. Okay, now let's go to infection or UTI. This is a very common infection, most common diagnosis in children, and this is mostly seen in children less than 1 year old. Okay, and the etiology is your colonic bacteria, your E. coli, Klebsiella, Proteus enterococcus, and also Pseudomonas. Now, there are 2 basic forms of UTI, your pyelonephritis and your cystitis. Pyelonephritis involves the upper urinary tract, your kidneys, and they usually present with abdominal or back flank pain, fever, malaise, nausea, vomiting, no? Rarely diarrhea, no? But some may present with diarrhea. But for newborns, since they have non-specific signs and symptoms, no? They may also only present with poor feeding, irritability, even jaundice or weight loss. No? For patients with under 2 years old, they usually present with fever. No? Kung minsan wala pa yung dysuria, wala pa abdominal pain. So fever without focus. Then you have to do your diagnostics. Now, pyelonephritis becomes significant because if left untreated, it can result to renal injury and cause pyelonephritic scarring. We know that kidneys doesn't regenerate. No? So once may scarring na yan, uh, the kidneys has sclerosis, it doesn't regenerate. So we already lose that kidney function. Okay? So it's very important that we treat these patients because they leave scars. And eventually, if it becomes recurrent and left untreated, then it may also result to chronic kidney disease. Okay? Cystitis, on the other hand, this involves usually your bladder infection, and they are more present with irritative symptoms like dysuria, urgency, frequency, suprapubic pain, incontinence, and malodorous urine. Okay. This is the pathogenesis of your UTI. It usually develops when the bacteria from the fecal flora colonize the perineum and enter the bladder via the urethra. No? Kaya our etiology are colonic bacteria, no? Because that is the route of entry. Now, the presence of the bacterial pili or fimbriae on the bacterial surface, this allows the bacteria to ascend to the urinary tract. And this then stimulates immunologic and inflammatory response, no, causing renal injury and scarring if left untreated. These are risk factors, no, of developing UTI. Female anatomy, why? Because of the anatomic distance pa lang, no, of your anus and the female anatomy. Uncircumcised male, age less than 1 year, presence of vesicoureteral reflux, toilet training even, no, because of sometimes they have urinary stasis for children with undergoing toilet training, void dysfunction, external irritation, etc. So these are the risk factors. Okay, so how do we diagnose? No, urinalysis is actually adequate. No, if you have clinical signs and symptoms of your urinary tract infection, you have to confirm it with urinalysis. And a midstream sample is actually adequate for toilet-trained children. According to the American Pediatrics, no, catheterized or suprapubic aspirate for 2 to 24 months is recommended, no, for those who are not toilet-trained. So what do you look for in the urinalysis? You have to look for the presence of nitrites, presence of leukocyte esterase, microscopic hematuria, or WBC tests. Okay, and a urine culture should be done for all patients you are suspecting of urinary tract infection. And this would be the confirmatory test for UTI. So for a suprapubic or catheter sample, more than 50,000 single colony is already significant. But for midstream urine sample, more than 100,000 single colony is a confirmatory of a urinary tract infection. Now, other labs, such as CBC, ASR, procalcitonin levels, and CRP may also be done, but as needed. If your patient is more toxic, you're considering of other more systemic infections, then you can do procalcitonin and CRP levels as well. Now for the treatment, for acute cystitis, this is the bladder infection. A 3-day antibiotic course is already adequate. Your cotrimoxazole, nitrofurantoin, or amoxicillin is adequate. For pyelonephritis, because it involves the kidneys and has more systemic systemic manifestations, then a longer course of treatment is required. So for 7 to 14 days of treatment is recommended. If for patients who can tolerate oral medications, oral cefixime or ciprofloxacin, for older children is recommended. But if your patient presents with vomiting or not able to tolerate the oral meds, then you can use your IV antibiotics like ceftriaxone, cefepime, or cefotaxime. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that pyelonephritis can cause renal scarring, and eventually, if left untreated or with repeated bouts of untreated pyelonephritis, then it may cause your chronic kidney disease. So it's very important to prevent recurrences and identify predisposing factors. And these are the most common predisposing factors: your bowel and bladder dysfunction. Your bowel and bladder dysfunction occurs during toilet training, and they usually manifest with urgency, wetting, especially yung Vincent's curtsy. So females squat on their heels in response to an uninhibited bladder contraction. So hindi pa talaga sila toilet trained. So what happens is that there is urinary stasis, so causing your posterior urethra to dilate, and there is bilateral reflux. Okay. Now, constipation. It may also promote urinary stasis and cause urinary tract infections. What we do is we do behavioral modification, and medical treatment for constipation. And lastly, your vesicoureteral reflux. It causes the urine to reflux upward to the ureters and then to the kidneys, and then it causes pyelonephritis. So how can we prevent this from happening? The use of antibiotic prophylaxis is recommended for patients, only for patients with urologic conditions such as your neurogenic bladder, urinary tract stasis because of obstruction, severe VUR, and urinary calculi. So other measures that we can do to prevent recurrences is the probiotic therapy. And it has been shown to inhibit bacterial growth. Cranberry juice has also been shown to prevent recurrences because it prevents bacterial adhesion and biofilm formation. Yeah. So it's true, but it's not used for treatment. Okay, your probiotic therapy and cranberry juice are not shown to be effective as treatment. It is effective as prevention, for prevention of recurrences. Okay, now we go to the renal tubular diseases. Now, renal tubules are responsible for reabsorption. So your glomerulus, your nephron, it's composed of your glomerulus and your tubules. So after filtration, we'll go to reabsorption, secretion, and excretion in the renal tubules. And it is also responsible for urine acidification. So for renal tubular disorders, we have actually two. And it has two different spectrum. The first spectrum is the acidosis, and the other one is alkalosis. So let's go through the acidosis first. Your renal tubular acidosis is characterized by a normal anion gap, hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis in the setting of a normal GFR. So there are four main types: your proximal type 2 RTA, your classic distal type 1 RTA, your hyperkalemic type 4 RTA, and your combined proximal and distal type 3 RTA. Okay, so diagnostic approach. How will you diagnose renal tubular acidosis? So the first step is to confirm the presence of a normal and ion gap metabolic acidosis. Okay, identify the electrolyte abnormalities, assess renal function, and then rule out other causes of bicarbonate losses, which results in the acidosis. So you take the blood pH, which should show acidosis. Serum electrolytes should show hypokalemia, hyperchloremia, hypercalciuria, and BUN and creatinine, we should also evaluate for renal function. Now, after this, you should compute for your blood and iron gap. And this is you can calculate this using the formula. And for an iron gap less than 12, it means there is absence of an iron gap. But if it's more than 20, then there is an iron gap. Definitely not a renal tubular acidosis. No? So your anion gap should be less than 12. Next is urinalysis. Okay, you check for the urine pH. It can help distinguish between your proximal causes and distal. A urine pH of less than 5.5 in the presence of acidosis suggests proximal RTA. Now, whereas patients with distal RTA typically have a urine pH of more than 6. Okay. Now, if once you taken the urine pH, you also look at the presence of glycosuria, proteinuria, or hematuria. And this is usually seen in patients with proximal RTA. Now, for that, the urine and iron gap may also be used, and it's calculated using this formula. And this also confirms the diagnosis of distal RTA. So if you have if the result is positive, it suggests a deficiency of amniogenesis, and thus it is a distal RTA. But a negative urine anion gap is consistent with proximal tubule bicarbonate wasting. Okay? So yun yung mga differences nila. Your anion gap will tell us if it's proximal or distal. Okay. Now, last is the renal, sonography. Your KUB ultrasound should be performed to identify other structural abnormalities as well. If it's obstructive uropathy or the presence of your nephrocalcinosis, which is seen in distal RTA. Yeah. So these simple diagnostics would help us identify which type of RTA are we dealing with. Oops. Okay. But the mainstay of treatment for both would be bicarbonate replacement. The difference would be just on the dose. So proximal type, since it has more bicarbonate wasting, you give higher bicarbonate replacement as compared to the distal type. And once you have addressed the acidosis in this patient, you will see improvement in growth. Okay. Now, thiazide diuretics, since patients may develop hypercalciuria and nephrocalcinosis, thiazide diuretics will help decrease urine calcium excretion. Okay, so this will help our patients with nephrocalcinosis. Now, for type 4 RTA, it can require chronic treatment for hyperkalemia using your sodium-potassium exchange resin. But your type 4 RTA is very rare. The most common that we see is our distal RTA. Now, this table summarizes the similarities and differences between your Barter's and Gitelman's syndrome, and these are the two diseases on the other spectrum. So your RTA has acidosis, but your Barter and Gitelman syndromes would present with alkalosis. So the main difference would be the failure to thrive. It's more prominent actually in Barter's syndrome. Polyuria as well. That's why dehydration is common for patients with Barter's syndrome, because polyuria is present. Both will present with metabolic alkalosis. Both will present with hypokalemia, but your serum magnesium, it's low in Gitelman syndrome, and your urinary calcium is low also in Gitelman's, but high in Barter's syndrome. So how do you check now if you have a patient with weakness, usually tubular disorders will present with weakness. And then you get your electrolytes, no? And you have low potassium. So when you get low potassium, you check for the ABGs. Is there acidosis or alkalosis? So when you have acidosis, think of an RTA and complete your diagnostic workup. If your patient has alkalosis, then you have to differentiate your Bartter versus your Gittelman syndromes using the following electrolytes. Okay. Now for the treatment, for Bartter, since they are associated with dehydration, no, because of polyuria, you have to prevent dehydration, maintain nutrition, and correct hypokalemia. On the other hand, Gittelman syndrome, you have to correct your hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia. Sometimes, if you are already correcting the hypokalemia in Gittelman syndrome, you'll still see spasms, no, carpopedal spasms, because you also have hypomagnesemia. So you also have to give magnesium supplementation. Okay. Right, this would be the last topic, no? The renal failure. Renal failure may also be acute or chronic. No? So for acute renal failure, this is already termed as acute kidney injury, is defined as an abrupt loss of kidney function leading to a rapid decline in your GFR, also accumulation of your waste products such as your BUN and creatinine, also dysregulation of extracellular volume and electrolyte homeostasis. Okay, and AKI occurs in 2 to 5% of hospitalized children and more than 25% in ICU patients. So the classification of AKI is based on the KDIGO standards, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. We used to have different staging of AKI, the P-rifle and the AKIN, but this is the most recent one, and this will be followed by nephrologists all over the world. So pan-standardized. This is the newly standardized staging of AKI. So for stage 1, you have serum creatinine of 1.5 to 1.9 times baseline, no? But most of the time, kasi for pediatrics, we do not have baseline creatinine. So we can rely on the definition of AKI based on the urine output. Excuse me. Now, there are 3 different causes of AKI. It could be pre-renal, intrinsic, or post-renal. Excuse me. Pre-renal AKI is caused by diminished effective circulating arterial volume. No, so if you have decreased volume, you will lead to inadequate renal perfusion and of course a decrease in GFR. There is no structural kidney damage, unlike your intrinsic renal disease. However, if the underlying cause, for example, dehydration, it was not reversed, it may also cause renal hypoperfusion. So kapag hindi siya na-reverse, there may be intrinsic renal disease may also be developed. No? So it is very important for pre-renal causes to be addressed immediately to prevent further progression to intrinsic renal disease. Okay? So pre-renal, ito yung dehydration, gastroenteritis, hemorrhage, burns. These diseases causes decreased GFR. Okay? Now, for the intrinsic renal AKI, it is characterized by renal parenchymal damage. So as I've said, it could be due to the sustained hypoperfusion. It can be due to the pre-renal that was not immediately addressed. It can also be due to glomerulonephritis, rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis, your hemolytic uremic syndrome, acute tubular necrosis, and so on. No? Okay, so lastly, your post-renal AKI. It includes disorders characterized by obstruction of your urinary tract. So you see there's posterior urethral valves, UPJO, UVJO, and the likes. No? And once the obstruction is relieved, it usually results in the recovery of your renal function. Okay? So it's very important, no, your history and physical examination would already indicate, no, is this pre-renal, intrinsic, or post-renal. So if there are signs of symptoms of fluid loss, dehydration, then it's probably pre-renal in cause, no? Signs of glomerular disease, such as hypertension, there is edema, no? Other multisystemic, or already a diagnosed case, then it indicates intrinsic renal cause. How about if you palpate blank mass, or there is urinary obstruction, signs of urinary obstruction, then it is most probably post-renal in origin. Excuse me. Okay. How about laboratories? No? Laboratory anomalies include a variety of findings. No? In your CBC, you can see anemia. It can be due to dilution, hemodilution. Could also be hemolytic, no, for SLE patients. Thrombocytopenia may also be seen, no, for SLE or those patients with hemolytic uremic syndrome. Excuse me. Other serologies like hyponatremia, presence of metabolic acidosis, of course, elevated BUN and creatinine are seen in these patients with acute kidney injury. No? Urinalysis may also show a variety of findings, hematuria, proteinuria, or combination of both, CAS and urinary eosinophils. Now, other laboratories or diagnostic imaging, would be chest radiography for those patients with complications such as cardiomegaly or pulmonary congestion due to fluid overload, and pleural effusions. No, these are complications of your sodium and water retention. Renal ultrasound, so this can actually reveal if you have obstruction. No? You can see hydronephrosis or hydroureter. So that would suggest urinary tract obstruction. Or also enlarged kidneys, the nephromegaly. It can also tell us that it is consistent with intrinsic renal disease. Now, other biomarkers such as your NGAL, your plasma neutrophil gelatinase associated lipocalin are also used, no? But again, it is not widely available. It's not readily accessible for all hospitals. No? Another test would be your cystatin C. Remember, one of the measures of your glomerular filtration is using cystatin C, and it's more reliable than your creatinine. So we can also use that cystatin C as a biomarker for your acute kidney injury. Now, treatment. The most common cause of kidney failure in children is dehydration. So assessment of fluid status is important. So history, you have losses. Then your physical examination shows signs of dehydration, your eyes, your skin, your urine output. Those would already tell you, baka this patient has pre-renal cause of AKI. So we have to restore the intravascular fluid first. That is our first goal. So we should restore it. We should use isotonic saline, 20 ml per kilogram over 20 to 30 minutes. And this may be repeated depending on the reevaluation. So reassess your patient of the fluid status. Once fluid resuscitation is adequate, then the patient should be able to urinate within 2 hours. So it doesn't mean na hindi siya nag-urinate, hindi pa restored. No? You have to look at your blood pressure and your heart rate. The two earliest to respond for intravascular volume. Okay? Now, if not, no, then maybe there is an intrinsic or post-renal cause. No, kaya you have to, again, reevaluate your patient. But, for example, you have given your saline, no, okay na yung vital signs, but your patient has still poor pulses, no? Then you have to think of other diseases, no? Maybe there is sepsis, no? Or maybe you can already add your vasopressors for these patients. Now, for patients with hypervolemia, the patients already with sodium and water retention, no? We may use diuretics already. No? So, for example naman, hypovolemia, no? Kapag na-restore mo na yung intravascular volume and you have normal vital signs, and you have signs of hypervolemia, then you may also use your diuretic therapy. Okay? Now, diuretics, if you are used only if you have signs of fluid overload. Furosemide at 2 to 4 milligrams per kilogram. Actually, we use it at 1 to 2 milligrams per kilogram. Or bumetanide at 0.1 milligram per kilogram. But bumetanide here is not available anymore. No, they may be given as boluses or maybe also as drip. No, for furosemide, we have been using that. No, for patients with medyo ano pa siya, labile ang kanyang vital signs. No? So you may also use those diuretics, no? If you have, depending on your assessment. But for example, there is no response, no, to diuretics, then it should be discontinued. And maybe fluid restriction should be considered. Hyperkalemia of serum potassium of more than 6 mg per liter can also be seen for acute kidney injury patients. And what we don't like for potassium is that it has an effect to your heart. No? So it can lead to arrhythmia, eventually cardiac arrest and death. No? So exogenous sources should be eliminated kasi mataas na nga eh. And we should give regimen, your hyperkalemic regimen, no, to decrease your hyperkalemia, your potassium. So give your resin therapy at 1 gram per kilogram, and this may be repeated every 2 hours. No? But we have to be alert, no, because your resin therapy may produce or may develop hypernatremia. So when you are correcting your electrolytes, you have to monitor them regularly. And serum monitoring is the only way that we can measure electrolytes. So it's either you monitor your electrolytes every 6 to 8 hours, depending on how high your electrolytes are. Okay, so other regimen that will decrease your potassium would be your calcium gluconate. Calcium gluconate actually does not decrease your potassium, but it stabilizes your heart muscles. No? Remember, your hyperkalemia has an effect on your heart. It may cause cardiac arrhythmia. So the priority would be giving your calcium gluconate to stabilize your myocardial contractility. Then followed by your sodium bicarbonate and your regular insulin plus glucose. And these agents will help decrease your potassium by shifting your potassium intracellularly. Okay, there. Other treatment, you have metabolic acidosis. So correct your metabolic acidosis using your sodium bicarbonate, hypocalcemia, hyponatremia. Now for hyponatremia, it could be just dilutional. No? So fluid restriction is recommended. No, but for patients with symptomatic hyponatremia, if they already have decrease in the level of consciousness, then a hypertonic 3% saline may be given. Anemia may also be present, no, even for acute kidney injury. Remember that your erythropoietin, it stimulates the production of your RBCs. It is produced in the kidneys. So if you have an acute kidney injury, you may also have decreased production and cause anemia. Nutrition should also be addressed. computation for sodium, potassium, and phosphorus should be done as well. No? So for these patients, we have your referral to a dietitian in the hospital to provide adequate nutrition for our acute kidney injury patients. Now, for acute kidney injury, as we mentioned, it is reversible, no? Um, but sometimes it's already severe. Signs and symptoms are severe. The fluid overload is severe. We have to do dialysis. Now, these are the indications for dialysis. Now, the choice for hemodialysis versus peritoneal dialysis actually is also dependent on the capacity of the hospital. No? So, for other hospitals, kasi they also have hemodialysis for children, no? But not all hospitals have that. So, most commonly, we use peritoneal dialysis. Okay, so indications would be patients with anuria or oliguria, if there is already volume overload with hypertension or pulmonary edema that is refractory to diuretic therapy, persistent hyperkalemia. So despite giving your anti-potassium regimen, your resin, your sodium bicarb, your glucose plus insulin plus glucose, hindi pa rin bumababa ang potassium, then it can be an indication for dialysis. Severe metabolic acidosis despite giving your sodium bicarbonate, signs of uremia, encephalopathy, pericarditis, and neuropathy, and calcium phosphorus imbalance with hypocalcemic tetany. So, ibig sabihin lang kasi that your kidneys are already failing and it cannot regulate your fluid electrolytes. And so, we have to do renal replacement therapy or your dialysis to act as a temporary kidney for our patients with acute kidney injury. So dialysis support, it may be necessary for days, no, or maybe up to weeks. But if the acute kidney injury gets prolonged, no, for more than 3 months, then it may become or progress to a chronic kidney disease. Okay. So prognosis, the mortality rate, no, and prognosis is variable, and it depends on the nature of the underlying disease. No? So there is a good chance for recovery for patients with pre-renal causes. No? However, there is poor chance or low prognosis for patients with rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis and bilateral renal vein thrombosis, and they may develop chronic renal insufficiency or chronic kidney disease, hypertension. Um, so we should be able to monitor these patients and treat the, the sequelae of your acute kidney injury. Okay? So for acute kidney injury, when it is unresolved or was not addressed immediately, it may develop into chronic kidney disease. No? And chronic kidney disease is defined as kidney damage for 3 months or more, with abnormalities in the composition of the blood or urine, abnormalities in imaging studies. Now your ultrasound may show a small kidneys already. No, those are signs that the kidney disease is already chronic. Abnormalities on kidney biopsy as well. No? So there are multiple sclerosis, sclerotic areas in your kidneys that will decrease your kidney function. Or if not, there is decrease in your GFR less than 60 for 3 months or more with or without the other signs of kidney damage. So the prevalence actually of CKD in children is 18 per 1 million. So for the Philippines, now we also have a number of chronic kidney disease, and maybe just 20% would have undergone renal transplantation. So when you see a patient with chronic kidney disease, again, like your AKI, no, we have to stage the severity of kidney damage, no, and we use this by computing for the GFR. Yeah, so there are 5 stages. Now, the etiology of pediatric CKD is subdivided into non-glomerular and glomerular causes. For glomerular causes, it may be congenital, no, acquired, or inherited. But for children less than 5 years old, CKD, the most common cause of CKD would be your congenital abnormalities of the kidney and urinary tract. Okay, yung kaput na tinatawag natin. So yung mga renal hypoplasia, dysplasia, or mga obstructive uropathy. But for older children older than 5 years old, acquired or inherited forms of glomerulonephritis are the most common cause of your chronic kidney disease. Okay. Now the pathogenesis, um, there is actually a progressive injury, renal injury, no, with ongoing um, metabolic or structural diseases. No? So it can progress, renal injury can progress despite removal of the original insult. No? So the most common pathogenesis would be your hyperfiltration injury. And it may be the more important final pathway of glomerular destruction. It is independent of the underlying cause of the renal injury. So what happens in hyperfiltration injury is that as nephrons are lost, the remaining nephrons, they compensate. No? So they undergo structural and functional hypertrophy uh, to compensate for the damaged ones. So that's what happens. No? So although it initially it will preserve the renal function, but as the damage or the injury progresses, the surviving glomeruli also have will also have a burden, eventually causing your hyperfiltration injury. Proteinuria itself can contribute to renal functional decline. Proteins, it can traverse your glomerular capillary wall, no, for those with nephrotic syndrome, and it can exert direct toxic effects on tubular cells, no, because of the inflammatory cells as well, and causing, no, sclerosis and fibrosis. How about hypertension? Uncontrolled hypertension can actually exacerbate the disease, the progression to CKD, no, because of arteriolar nephrosclerosis, and also it adds up with the hyperfiltration injury. Hyperphosphatemia, it decreases your GFR by contributing directly, no, to the progression of the disease, no? And it leads to calcium phosphate deposition in the interstitium and blood vessels, no, again adding further into the renal injury. Hyperlipidemia, and it's a common condition also in CKD patient, it can adversely affect your glomerular function, no, through the oxidant-mediated injury. Okay, so a lot of chemical, biochemical, and clinical conditions, no, taking place in your chronic kidney disease patient. Now, how do we treat these patients? The goal of CKD management is mainly to give supportive treatment, no? And this is to improve the quality of life. And no, we cannot reverse the kidney injury, as we've mentioned. Kidneys do not regenerate. No, so we can only slow down the progress of the disease. From CKD to CKD5, we can slow it down. No? And so we should make sure that everything is taken care of. No? First concern would be your nutrition. So magdi-decrease ba tayo or increase? No? The recommendation is that the patient with CKD should still receive 100% of the daily recommended intake. Okay, so we can give vitamin supplements, but it should be computed and within the 100% diuretic daily recommended intake. Okay, now mineral and bone disorder, CKD is associated with mineral and bone disorder because of the secondary hyperparathyroidism remember that your vitamin D metabolism can not only lead to bone disorders, but also affects your vascular calcification. No? So these patients should be maintained on low phosphorus diet, phosphate binders, no, to enhance your GI excretion. Ergocalciferol or cholecalciferol enhances formation of your vitamin D3 because your vitamin D is also activated in your kidneys. No, that's why you have decreased vitamin D. Suppress PTH production and calcitriol to improve calcium and phosphorus absorption in the GI tract. Okay. How about fluids and electrolytes? Fluid intake should be carefully monitored. No? So generally, CKD patients would benefit from fluid restriction and diuretic therapy. Okay, so hyperkalemia may also be addressed, no, as those hyperkalemic regimen that we've mentioned earlier. Uh, sodium bicarbonate or sodium citrate, no, for metabolic acidosis may be given. Now, CKD patients also have short stature, no, and because of the metabolic acidosis, chronic metabolic acidosis, and poor nutrition. No? So other countries have used recombinant human growth factor until the goal is that the patient reaches the 50th percentile. So once you've achieved that, you may stop giving your recombinant human growth factor. Excuse me. How about anemia? Anemia is due to the inadequate erythropoietin production. And also, if your patient has uremia, it also decreases the erythrocyte survival. So overall, there is anemia or decreased RBCs. So we have to give your iron supplementation and erythropoiesis stimulating agents. Now, erythropoiesis stimulating agents may be given 2 to 3 times a week. This is via injection. Most of our patients, no, mga teenagers, they are the ones who administer their ESAs. No? But for younger children, we teach the parents to do it. So they can do it at home. They don't need to come to the hospital just for administration of their erythropoiesis stimulating agents. Hypertension and proteinuria. Hypertension proteinuria is secondary to volume overload and excessive renin production. So dietary restriction of sodium and antihypertensive medicines should be given. And among the antihypertensive, your ACE inhibitors and your ARBs are the first choice because they are renoprotective. So meaning they can slow down the progression of CKD. Diuretics, no? Thiazide and diuretics may also be used. It is not just for the fluid, no? It may also be for the hypertension. No? Other hypertensives, such as your calcium channel blockers, your beta blockers, or centrally acting agents, may also be used. Sometimes our patients require more than 2 antihypertensive medications. No? And ayun, so we use different antihypertensives, but you have to maximize the doses first before we can add a new antihypertensive. Okay, but ultimately, renal transplantation is still the definitive treatment for end-stage renal disease. And with renal transplantation, there is improved quality of life and decreased mortality rate. And the center of renal transplantation is at the National Kidney Transplant Institute. We do 6 to 7 renal transplantations for children a year. So we have improved outcomes already. And we can do, while waiting for the renal transplantation, we can do renal replacement therapy, urodialysis. No? While waiting, it will act as their kidneys. But eventually, no, we still have to do renal transplantation. Yeah. Okay, so that ends my lecture. Thank you for listening. Do you have any questions? I apologize for the what do you call this, technical or connectivity issues earlier. So I just had to transfer, I have to change my internet connection. So the video